Thank you so much for joining me for Data Storytelling for Music Educators. My name is Rachel LaRue, and I am the Director of Marketing for Music First. Today's session is going to focus on how you can use the data that you've collected on your students' performance to communicate with stakeholders. Those stakeholders include school administrators, parents, and even your students themselves. We're going to explore the process behind establishing your goals, collecting and analyzing that data, and determining what visual representations most effectively communicate your findings. This session does assume familiarity with Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets and with Microsoft PowerPoint or Google Slides. Let's get started. So let's start with the big question. What is data storytelling anyway? Well, it's the art of using visual tools to convey findings in an intuitive and meaningful way. In short, it's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to statistical analysis and graphic design. You've seen so much of it in the past year with COVID case count trackers, winter storm trackers, election result maps, and even with GameStop stock price trackers. These graphic representations use thousands and thousands of individual little data points and take them from unintelligible spreadsheet to stunning graph. As educators, you know that formative and summative assessments are absolutely crucial in informing your instructional techniques. By collecting and visualizing data, you'll be able to more easily recognize patterns and adjust your teaching accordingly. But specifically, what are we looking for this data collection and analysis to help us with? First, to verify your gut feelings. You know your students better than anyone, and you'll often find that what your intuition is telling you about your instructional efficacy is often correct. However, we're only human, and we're all subject to those neurological idiosyncrasies that don't always allow us to see the full picture. For instance, you may have a specific tool that you have used to great effect in the past and are predisposed to see it as efficacious, but the data may tell a different story. You could also be spot on with your gut feelings. In this case, you can use data to look closely at how effective your techniques are. Maybe you've put in a concerted recruitment effort with your band program, and you know that the numbers have grown over the past 5 years. But there's something helpful about knowing exactly how those numbers have changed. 5% growth year over year is different than 15. This brings us to change over time. Data visualization is perfect for demonstrating change over time. This is excellent for tracking student growth over the course of the year, but specifically tracking that rate of change. This is especially important when implementing a new instructional technique or adopting a new tool. You'll be able to continue to capture the same data points and compare how quickly your students grasp new concepts with the new tool versus the old. Did their rate increase, decrease, or stay flat? You may be surprised at what patterns emerge. You may have known that your students were struggling with note identification, but not realize the extent to which they were struggling. Now that you've discovered that there's a larger knowledge gap than you had initially suspected, you can use that same data to tease out the why. You may notice correlations, but remember that these are just clues to identify root causes. At the end of the day, you want to be effective. You want to make the best decisions that you can for your students and make the most of your instructional time. And you also want to be able to demonstrate to administrators, parents, and even the students themselves that what you're doing is working. When authors begin to write a novel, they often begin with an outline, and the same is true when you're telling a story with data. Going into the process with a plan allows you to focus your efforts, collect necessary information, and ensure that you have any ancillary data that you'll need to tell the whole story later on. So first, determine what your goals are. What question or questions are you trying to answer? What information are you trying to glean from the data? The more specific you are with your goals, the better able you'll be to answer question number 2. And that is, what data will you need to collect? Let's assume that you're interested in determining how successful your students are at sight singing. Well, that's a really complex question and requires collecting a lot of different data points. You'll want to know things like, how well do my students understand key signatures? How adept are they at identifying intervals? Are they confident with compound meters? Are they comfortable with large intervallic leaps? You're going to need to identify key competencies that your students will need for success at an age and skills appropriate level. So this means changing how well do my students understand key signatures to, are my students able to identify major and minor keys up to 3 sharps and 3 flats? You now know that you'll need to collect specific data points related to this specific skill. Will this information be used exclusively to determine your students' sight singing abilities? Absolutely not. You'll be able to use this data to answer more questions about your students' conceptual understanding of music theory too. Whenever possible, identify data points that you'll be able to use to provide more insights into your students' comprehension. And number 3 is a big one. How do you collect this data? In order for data to be informative and useful, it needs to be collected quickly, frequently, and consistently. If you were to collect outdoor weather data sporadically, it would be really difficult to paint a meaningful picture of the climate in a particular locale. The same goes for collecting any other type of data. The more information you have, the more insights you'll be able to glean. But in your role, you're a teacher, not necessarily a researcher. So what you need are methods and tools to obtain data quickly and store it easily so that you will be consistent with your collection. This is where technology and automated assessment tools are extremely useful for you. When thinking about collecting your data, it's important to consider how you'll likely present your findings. Will it be a scatter plot? Will it be a bar chart? Will each student be represented individually, or are you going to be grouping them together by instrument and voice type? Familiarize yourself with different types of charts, such as histograms, word clouds, or scatter plots. You don't need to be an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but having a few options you're comfortable working with will help you tell your story more effectively. Pick a few solid options that display data in different ways, and you'll be well on your way. Finally, think about who will be seeing these visualizations and how they'll be receiving them. Will you need to ensure that identifying student information is removed? Will your viewer have access to the same software as you? Will it need to be printable? In addition to formatting, we'll talk a little bit about design. A consistent, clean design with only 1 or 2 fonts, high-res images, and complementary, consistent colors can go a really long way in instilling trust. Now let's get into data collection. Since I am most familiar with Music First Classroom, I'm going to be using that particular learning management system to do my demonstrations. However, these same concepts can be applied to whatever learning management system you happen to be using. What you're really looking for in a data collection and assessment platform are the following. 1, a built-in customizable gradebook, and 2, the ability to export those grades as a CSV file. Items that aren't absolutely necessary but are really, really nice to have are things like the ability to sort students into groups, such as voice type, instrument type, etc., pre-made assessments and assignments, a unified assignment submission portal, and an auto-populated gradebook. Now, the reason that I'm stressing these nice-to-have features is because of what I mentioned in the last slide, and that's data collection must be quick, frequent, and consistent. The more time you're devoting to creating assessments, tracking down students' recordings, manually grading assignments, and entering those grades in a gradebook, the less likely you are to actually collect the data. There was a study done in 2018 by the Pew Charitable Trusts that showed companies who auto-enrolled their employees in retirement plans had a 90% participation rate in the plan versus 50% participation rate in companies who did not auto-enroll their employees. What I mean to say by this is that we do what is easy. By being strategic and eliminating barriers to your participation in data collection, you're making it easier for yourself to do the thing you want to do, which is collect the student data. Here, I'm going to show you one way in which you might collect student data on interval recognition. I'll be using the ear training software Aurelia, which is a Music First Classroom software integration. It covers topics ranging from intervals and scales all the way to multi-part melodic dictation. I think it's a wonderful tool for choral ensembles especially. In this example, I've created a 10-question quiz which randomly generates unison, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, or octave intervals, and the student must listen to the interval, identify it, and then select the appropriate response. What you're looking at right now is a sped-up student view of the quiz. The student receives real-time feedback on their performance, and that visual feedback helps inform their answers to subsequent questions. What I'm showing you now is the teacher view of the gradebook within the Music First classroom. Along the left-hand side is a list of all of the students in the class, and immediately to the right, you'll see the scores for the assessment I just showed you. I didn't have to do any manual grading. Aurelia simply sent the scores directly to the Music First classroom gradebook for the student, and as a teacher, I have the ability to view, edit, or export the grade at my discretion. I can exclude the grade from the student's overall average, add a note to the assignment, and even view the assignment from the gradebook. Now you may be thinking, that's great, but I don't have Aurelia, so this isn't going to work for me. Don't worry, there's more than one way to create the same kind of assessment, which you can then reuse. Within the Music First classroom, you have the ability to create custom assessments. In this case, I'm creating a 10-question multiple choice quiz. I've used FLAT to create 10 intervals, all of them unison, perfect fourths, perfect fifths, or octaves, and exported each as an MP3 file. Within the question field, I'm able to upload the audio file so that the students can listen to the excerpt and then select one of the 4 multiple choice questions. I can even randomize the order in which the multiple choice answers appear and adjust the total points a question can earn. These assessments are extremely customizable. If I wanted to, say, embed a video into a question and ask for a free-form response, I could. The possibilities are almost endless. What you're looking at now is the student view of the assessment I just made. Just like the previous assessment in Aurelia, this grade will auto-populate the gradebook, and your students don't need to download any special software or open up a new browser. They can do this assessment all in the Music First classroom interface. When they hit submit, you'll get their answers without having to hunt down their submissions. Now, if I toggle back to the teacher view, I can use a very cool feature built into the Music First classroom and look at the assessment analytics for this particular assessment. I can see all of the submissions for each student and their grades, but if I select the Results tab, I'm going to get an even more in-depth look at how my students performed. I can see what the minimum, average, and top grades were, any frequently missed questions, and the array of answers given for any question. If I click on either of the frequently missed questions link, it takes me directly to the analytics for that question, so I don't need to scroll around hunting for it. These particular results let me know that I'm going to need to revisit the topic of recognizing perfect fourths. Now, while I've shown you a couple of assessment examples, I've really limited what I've discussed in favor of time. The Music First classroom has a number of software integrations which can be used to collect student data on everything from performance proficiency to composition to audio production. What I'm showing you is just the tip of the iceberg. So now back to analyzing our current assessment data. I've been working on interval recognition with my students for the past month, and I've been assigning weekly assessments to check in on their progress. You can see that I've organized my gradebook so that I can choose to view those gradebook items which I've included in the interval recognition assessment group. Because right now I'm interested in looking at my students' performance in that particular area. At first glance, when you look at the class average at the bottom of the gradebook, my students seem to be improving. Every week their average scores improve, but I can see in the students' average scores they're kind of all over the map. Well, because my gradebook is customizable, I'm able to group my students according to my own parameters and then take a closer look at their performance. When I change my student view in the gradebook, I can now see that the average score of the Sopranos is significantly lower than the class average in this particular area. So let's go ahead and go back. And let's export these results so that we can get a better visualization of what's happening here. Now I've exported the gradebook data as a CSV file and opened it in Google Sheets. You could also do exactly what I'm about to show you in Excel or in Numbers, but since so many educators use Google Sheets, I'm going to demonstrate it here. If you look at this data set, you can see the scores each student received over the course of 5 rounds of interval identification assessments. However, I'm going to hazard a guess that if I were to ask you to identify which voice part had the highest scores overall, it would be pretty difficult for you to tell me right off the bat. I'm also guessing that it would be pretty difficult for you to determine if each voice part scored progressively higher on subsequent tests. Would it be easy for you to tell which voice part performed best overall? I'm going to show you how to quickly create a bar chart which will allow you to easily answer all 3 of these questions. First, we need to insert a chart by selecting Insert and then Chart, and then select what type of chart you'd like to use from the drop-down. In this case, I want to show how groups of students performed on each assessment and compare those assessments to each other, so I'm going to select Column Chart. Second, think about what you want your X and Y axis data points to be. In this case, we want voicing on the X axis and the assessment score 0 to 100 on the Y axis. The bars will be each individual assessment. Define the data range for the X axis by selecting the Groups column, then select Aggregate because we want to group these individual data points with their counterparts. Now, let's define the bars. Under Series, select Add Series, and then select the entire column of scores for the first assessment. By the way, you can see what happens now if I deselect Aggregate. The voice parts separate, so let's reselect Aggregate. Well, we want to see the average scores for each assessment over time, so we'll need to add more bars. In order to do that, simply add another series. But wait, now you'll notice that the y-axis has changed from 0 to 100 to 0 to 300. That's because the chart is adding the scores from each column together, not collecting the average. So to fix this, simply select Sum and change it to Average for each new series. Now that we have an intelligible chart, it's time to focus on details so that it's intelligible quickly. First, let's open it up on a new sheet so that we can more clearly see what we're working with. Select the 3 dots on the upper right corner of the chart and then move to Own Sheet. That's much better. Now we've got space to work. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that clarity and design go hand in glove. So what we're going to do now is prepare the chart to be shared. Let's select Edit Chart so that we can actually work on the chart in Google Sheets before exporting it to its final destination. We've got the basic data graphed, but we're missing some crucial elements, namely titles. Without already knowing the context of this information, it would be pretty difficult to understand what we're talking about. So, under Customize, select Chart and Axis Titles. Name the chart something that makes sense, like Interval Recognition Assessments by Voice Type, and then select Chart Subtitle. I often find that including a time period here is really helpful, especially when looking at growth over time like we are here. Ensure that you name both X and Y axes, and that you're specific about how you're naming them, especially if the axis is numeric. 0 to 100 could be 0 to 100 anything. 0 to 100 points, 0 to 100 marshmallows. Just make sure that you're clear. You may decide that you want to move the legend to a different part of the chart because there's too much text either at the top or the bottom of a chart. It's entirely up to you, but it's important that whatever you do consistently. If you're going to be displaying multiple charts in a presentation, maintain the same formatting across the board. But most importantly, make sure that any changes you make are not purely aesthetic. They need to serve a purpose. If your change makes the data easier to understand, then make the change. If not, ask yourself why you're doing it. For example, I select inside for the legend placement and the chart becomes more cluttered. Always prioritize clarity. To make trends more visible, it may help to adjust the scale of the chart. Instead of starting the x-axis at 0, in this case we might try starting it at 50. This will help you more easily visualize smaller intervals. Remember how I discussed thinking about collecting data points that you can use in multiple ways? Well, by collecting lots of individual data points for students, I'm creating the ability for this particular data set to provide me lots of different insights. Instead of being interested in how different groups of students are doing, I now want to look at how all of my students are performing over time. Are their performance trajectories similar? Do I have outliers who may need additional focused attention? By creating a line chart in this scenario, I'm going to be able to view all of my students' performance in a single glance. Are they all headed in the right direction? Let's find out. First, we're going to insert another chart, but this time we're going to select a line from the chart drop-down menu. In Data Range, select all of the cells you'll be pulling data from. Make sure to include your students' first or last names so that you can identify them on the graph. You'll notice that the line graph that auto-populates has a few errors. I'm not really interested in this information right now, but you can immediately glean some information here. It appears that one student in particular may be struggling more than the others. But let's get back to the job at hand. Select Switch Rows and Columns. You can now easily see how all of your student scores have changed over time. If I want to hide identifying student information, it's easy for me to simply navigate to Customize, go to the Legend dropdown, and then select None under the Position dropdown. This removes the students' names so that I could share this information without calling out specific students' performance, but rather focus on the overall effectiveness of my instructional technique. Remember, before you share this graph, don't forget to label your chart and axes. Now let's get to the fun part, design. We talked a little bit about design when thinking about how to lay out your graphic representations of data, but now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of how to really make your presentations shine. I mentioned at the start of the presentation that a little bit of effort here can go a long way. Have you ever been to a website where the content is amazing, but it's difficult to navigate? The page is cluttered with images and text. What images there are pixelated, some of the links are dead, and heaven forbid, they've even used the papyrus font. Even if the site's content is exceptional, you may find yourself distracted by the site's disorganization, and worse still, you may find yourself subconsciously questioning the site's legitimacy or the quality of the content. The human brain likes symmetry and patterns. We are hardwired to take mental shortcuts. It's what helps us make sense of the world around us. When we're presented with new information, our brains want to synthesize that information with our existing knowledge. If our brain is presented with new information along with a barrage of other information like images, it's more difficult for our brain to tease out what's important and what's extraneous. So the key here is simplicity. Next, let's get into consistency. When thinking about consistency in a presentation, you want to focus on three main components: color, typography or fonts, and layout. When we're considering which colors you want to use, you can always refer to sources. You can use web-based tools like ColorMind to automatically generate a variety of color palettes, or even upload an image and create a color palette from that uploaded image. If you want your presentation to take on the look and feel of your school's branding, for instance, you can use a web-based tool like SitePalette, which is a Chrome extension that generates a color palette based on the colors on a web page. You can also use one of my favorite Chrome extensions called Eyedropper, and this allows you to pick up a color from anywhere on a web page and get the unique hex code. So what's a hex code? A hexadecimal code is a 6-digit alphanumeric value assigned to a unique color. Want to reproduce the exact same green every time? This is what you use. Now, with fonts, less is more. You really don't want to use more than 3, and 3 may even be pushing it. I'd recommend 1 to 2, and if you'd like, you can pair a serif with a sans serif font for visual interest. A serif font has decorative strokes that finish off the ends of letters, like in Times New Roman, whereas a sans serif font does not, like Arial. Sans serif fonts are a little easier to read than serif fonts, so if you want the reader to slow down, like in the title of a presentation, you can use a serif font. If you want to encourage them to continue reading, like in the body of the text, that would be a great place to use a sans serif font. Again, if you want your presentation to take on the look and feel of your school's branding, you could use a Chrome extension called What Font. When activated, you can find out what font is being used by hovering over the text on a web page. Don't have that font already? That's okay. You can download and install hundreds of fonts for free using Google Fonts. You can find this at fonts.google.com. Google Fonts will even recommend font pairings for you. The most important thing here to remember is consistency. Make sure that your charts and graphs, along with your accompanying text, are using the same fonts and colorways. It's distracting to look at a chart that looks blatantly out of context with the rest of the content on a page. When considering your layout, remember that less, again, is more. You want the data to speak for itself. So adding extraneous images, text, or design elements can distract from your goal of conveying information quickly and effectively. If your presentation is multiple pages or multiple slides, you want to ensure layout consistency across those elements. This is where templates, whether pre-made or self-made, can be really helpful. Rather than having to recreate a Google slide every time, you can simply hit New Slide. Lastly, think about image integrity. Whenever possible, use high resolution or large images so they don't become pixelated. You can always make a large image smaller and retain its visual integrity, but that doesn't work the other way around. Ensure that your images don't have watermarks. If your image does have a watermark, it's probably copyrighted material which shouldn't be used. There are a variety of places for you to find royalty-free images, like Pexels, or even the stock images available directly in PowerPoint where you go when you insert a picture. Finally, take note of the file type you're using for an image. PNG files are less lossy than JPEG files, but basically a good rule of thumb is that JPEGs are really great for photos, PNGs are good for text and graphs. PNGs are also the file format of choice if you're looking for an image with a transparent background. I'm sure you've all seen images with those pesky white backgrounds. PNG file formats allow this to be removed. When planning your presentation, think about the context in which it will be viewed. Sometimes you may need to make two versions of the presentation, one that's printable and one that's viewable on a screen. To prevent visual distortions like stretching, think about the aspect ratio of the device screen on which the information will be displayed, or the size of the paper on which the information will be printed. For modern screens, widescreen, or an aspect ratio of 16:9 is typically preferred. If it's going to be printed, consider whether your viewers will have access to a color printer. If not, you may need to actually add additional labels to your data in your charts because your audience won't be able to glean visual cues from color. You may also need to adjust your chart legends accordingly. Now ask yourself if your audience will have access to the same software that you have access to. There's nothing more frustrating than being sent a file only to have no way to open it since you're missing the necessary software to read the file type. While Google Slides, Keynote, and PowerPoint presentations will open across these software titles, sometimes information can get garbled in translation. What you had carefully formatted in one software program is now squished and distorted in another. If there's narration, you may want to consider just recording your presentation and sharing the video file via YouTube or Vimeo. You also have the option to export Word, Google Docs, Pages documents, and slideshow presentations as PDFs. Why are PDFs so useful? Well, short for portable document format, PDFs preserve document formatting. PDFs are not constrained by image size, and if your viewer is working on a device like a Chromebook, PDFs can be opened directly in a browser. Finally, and very importantly, PDFs are primarily used for viewing, not editing. That doesn't mean that someone who with specialized software and the know-how can't edit your PDF, but it's not something that most people are going to be doing. If you want to retain your Google Doc or slide file type, however, just ensure that the person with whom you're sharing the document does not have editing permissions. Now, a fun little pro tip that I like to use in PowerPoint is the ability to save a slide deck as a show. This means that when someone opens the file, it doesn't actually open the full PowerPoint editor interface. Instead, it opens straight to the first slide. This is a really nice feature for when you're doing a presentation and you don't want to risk the audience seeing your thumbnails and notes. It just opens right to the presentation. So instead of saving the file as a PPTX file, you should save it as a PPTS file. Finally, ensure that your information is presented clearly. A few helpful questions to consider when building a visual representation are as follows. What's my goal? Revisit the same question you did when you were collecting your data. What point am I trying to get across to my audience? Make sure that what you're presenting is aligned with what you're trying to accomplish. 2, how does this element contribute to achieving my goal? So take a look at all of your visual elements. Are they helping your cause, or did you just put them there for no real reason? If it's not helping you make a point, take it away. Is expository text needed? Maybe your charts are great, but you want to make absolutely sure that your audience knows your data collection methods, what the implications are, and what conclusions you arrived at. Make sure that your audience comes to understand the data as you do, or at least understands your perspective, even if they disagree. Take one last look and ask if there's anything you can eliminate. If it's not serving you, get rid of it. A good rule of thumb for clarity is that your viewer should get a pretty good sense of what they're looking at within 5 seconds. There may be levels of complexity that it takes a while to understand, but they should get the gist pretty quickly. Now let's use this data to make a presentation. So I'm going to open up a Google Slides document and select a theme. Now, all these themes have colors and fonts that I don't necessarily want to use. So what I'm going to do is go into the slide and edit master. This is going to allow me to change all of the colors and all of the fonts for every single slide in this theme. So even if I want to use multiple different types of slides, so different slide formats, all of the colors, all of the fonts, all of the formatting is actually gonna stay completely consistent all the way across. Now, I've sped up this process just because it is a little bit tedious the first time you set it up, but it is gonna save you a lot of time in the long run. And then you can save this as a theme. So if you are planning on doing multiple presentations throughout the course of the year, all you have to do is set this up one single time. So when I was talking about hex codes, you can see there's like a little spot for the hex. That's exactly where you're going to put that hex code in to identify exactly which color you want to use. Now you can see what I'm doing is editing the actual font that I'm going to use in all of these slides. There you go. And now I'm going to pick the kind of slide format that I actually want to use to present my data. Okay, so now I'm actually going to go back to the chart itself, and I'm going to make some edits to the chart. So I'm going to change the font, and I'm going to change the colors so that all of it matches and looks consistent across both the chart and the presentation format, so the Google slide. Again, this is where I might use hex colors to make sure that the colors of each of the bars is reflective of the colors that I'm using on the presentation itself. Okay, so I sped it up so you can see what happens next. I'm going to go ahead and insert a chart, and I'm going to insert the chart from the actual sheet. There it is. It populates. It matches beautifully. I'm going to put it in, and then I'm going to change the title. Great. So now what I am going to do is I'm going to export this. So I can either email it to someone, or in this case, I'm going to download it. And I want to put it into a PDF so that basically it'll be uneditable. There it is. Looks really nice, right? Now, another thing you can do is change the formatting if it needs to be printed. So go to Page Setup, and rather than having that widescreen format, you're going to do a custom. So 8.5 by 11 for your standard sheet of paper. Apply. And you're going to need to do a little bit of editing to make sure that this still looks good on the actual 8.5 by 11 format. And now you're going to do the same thing where you go ahead and click File, Download, and you're going to download it as a PDF, and then you can share it. That's it. Now, this is a very cursory overview of what tools you have at your disposal to make beautiful graphic representations of student data. There is so much more to explore if you really want to go down that rabbit hole, but my philosophy is just to pick up a couple of skills, hone them, and then execute them really well. I hope that what you take away from this presentation are the key concepts in gathering, collecting, and representing data, tips for how to graphically represent that data in a visually compelling way, and that you're inspired to play with these software tools yourself. Thank you so much for joining me, and if you have any questions at all, you can feel free to reach out to me by email at rachel@musicfirst.com. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your conference.